We're talking pot on the heels of a new presentation about lessons learned since marijuana was legalized in Colorado and changes that still may be ahead. The presentation put together for the governor by his marijuana czar, Andrew Freedman, officially known as Colorado's Director of Marijuana Coordination. You've been in this role for almost 3 years.
Almost 3 years, yeah.
What has changed in that role from when it took effect right after we passed retail marijuana?
Yeah.
What do you do differently then versus what you do differently now?
Oh, I think there's been 10,000 changes. Edibles look fairly different than they did. We can no longer have edible gummy bears, for instance. They have to be in shapes that are not as child-friendly, and now they're stamped with a universal symbol so that you know that they're edibles. And so I think there's been changes like that throughout the system. And then we're also starting to get in the first bits of data. We still consider baseline data, both public health, public safety, youth prevention, but it's good data for us to start building that baseline and start to figure out where we need reform.
How many years would you like to have data for before you're like, okay, we know this is a trend?
Well, I think a lot of these things are more 6 to 10 year trends. Public health takes a long time to change and then show up in the data. But, we'll look at everything as it comes through.
All right, let's talk at the federal level. The president-elect's choices for Attorney General, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, Health and Human Services, Georgia Congressman Tom Price, and Homeland Security, General John Kelly. All outspoken against marijuana use or legalization.
Yep.
How do those 3 nominations impact what you do?
Well, it could impact Colorado greatly. The entire marijuana industry rests on 2 memos written by the Department of Justice that, frankly, they could overturn with a stroke of a pen. It wouldn't even need to go to Congress in any way. And if that happens, I think there's some things we worry about, which is there's a lot of things that exist in our Constitution that don't take any enforcement, home grows, for instance. And we're worried those things will actually explode and create a pretty big black market. And what will be taken away is our regulators who look after public safety and public health.
Do you work on emergency plans?
We think about every contingency as it comes through, and I think we would also like to be part of the conversation to make sure that any step from here on out considers public safety and public health.
All right, so you had a state of the state essentially on pot, and there were a few slides from this presentation that I found helpful. And the first one is a Healthy Kids Colorado survey, which is this chart here that showed cigarette use among teens over a 1-month period was down. That's that bottom graph. The middle shows that pot use among teens around that same month period was up, almost about 2%, both up and then down on the cigarette use. Does this mean more teens are using pot instead of cigarettes?
Well, more teens are definitely using 30-day use of marijuana than cigarettes. Cigarettes have been on a pretty precipitous decline for the last 20 years, I think, as we've gotten better at public education campaigns. We do view that data as flatlined, basically, for marijuana use. It's slightly down from right before legalization, slightly up from 2 years ago, but it's all within the margin of error. And so, generally, we see that as short-term good news. As availability goes up, roughly 4 out of 5 kids are still not regularly using marijuana in high school, and that's way down from the 90s. And so we do want to figure out what messages will continue to work such that we see the sort of decline that cigarettes have seen after the Truth campaign came out.
Well, let's talk about this one that's showing up behind us here, the hospitalization trends. Walk me through, there's a spike here from 2014 to June 2015. What is this showing me?
So people are, when they come into the hospital, more often coding for marijuana, which means somewhere in their conversation with their doctor, they're mentioning marijuana. It's either the cause of them showing up or the doctor asks if they're using marijuana. We're careful with this data because now that it's legal, people might more often admit to marijuana use than they did before. So we're watching it, but it's a concerning trend. And what we see is maybe that's part of it. Maybe part of it is edibles, and particularly tourists with edibles that seem to be over-consuming, having 2 or 3 doses because they think the first dose didn't work and they didn't wait 2 hours. And then maybe they have 3 doses and then they drink alcohol and then they have a rough night. And so when we dig into the data, that's generally what we're seeing.
So then there's a second slide that kind of transitions into that about the hospitalization or the exposure of marijuana, and this is broken down by age group. And I kind of want to point out the orange color right here. These are 9 to 17-year-olds, and that spikes since retail marijuana was legalized. But the whole, those last 2 bars by themselves have gone up. So this is telling us that reports to the poison centers that they're getting calls because of marijuana exposure by all these age groups?
Yes, everything is trending slightly upward along the way. We do try to caution. It's still about 2 to 3% of what alcohol is coming in at, but. And again, I think a lot of this is education about edibles, because a lot of what we're hearing is that people are taking too many edibles, or kids are accidentally consuming edibles and calling Poison Control Center afterwards.
How do you address that?
Well, we've done a number of things. First of all, now marijuana edibles have to leave the manufacturer in childproof resealable packaging that looks a lot more like a medicine bottle than it does like a bag of candy. And the second one is that you can no longer have marijuana in the shape of gummy bears or fruit or something that's just is naturally attractive to kids in that way. And then the third one is now marijuana edibles come with a universal symbol on it that warns people that this actually has THC in the product.
And I know earlier you said you're not sure if it's because it's more okay to say I use pot now that it's legal. At what point do you say this data no longer includes that, openness?
I think the trend line going forward is something to watch. Is this becoming a more prevalent problem, or because that's what's going to show? Is this becoming, considering these 2 years as baseline, will we see the next year a lot more? I mean, we're basically flat for the first 2 years, which tells me a lot of it was just about reporting data, not all of it, but the fact that there was no growth between 2014 and 2015 was a good initial sign.
Now, going back to the federal question I had about how the nominations could impact you, I was once told by a source that there's really nothing but trust that is stopping federal agents from raiding a pot shop, taking all of the product and all of the money and saying, thank you very much, you just funded, new weapons and new whatever for us. And looking at how much we bring in sales and excise taxes, do you have a plan for if the feds suddenly just come in and start raiding pot shops?
Well, I don't. There's no way to create a plan for everything. But I think what we would say is, again, we really want to have a conversation before we move to such a place of uncertainty. And I think it will be detrimental if we go to that uncertain place where, without a memo being overturned or without any statement from the federal government, they start raiding pot shops. I think we'll be in a problematic area at that point. But it is a world of uncertainty, and people who have entered it know that. It is built on trust that this won't happen.
But you had a look on your face like that's not likely, it looked like.
I think more likely is people will start to get letters that say that this is not something that's going to be, this is something that'll be prosecuted going forward, and people will have to decide, do I want to risk that or do I want to go forward with it? I think it would be unlikely to just ignore the memos as they exist. I think more likely they would repeal the memos.
We'll probably have to visit with you sometime after January when we start to know a little bit more.
It'll be my pleasure.
All right. Stay with us. We'll be right back.